I'm super excited to hop into it today. I'm here to give you my first impressions of the Steam Deck, so let's just go ahead and deck it out. Welcome to Mike Techs It Out. I'm Mike, and I'm here to talk all about the Steam Deck. This is the 64 gig model, and I'm just here to give you my first impressions of what it's like for the first 3 weeks of ownership. I mentioned it in my unboxing video that I was interested to see if storage would be an issue, and I'm actually going to talk about the storage first because I really feel like this is an important component of this Steam Deck, and it was so frustrating for the first 48 hours that I had this thing. I almost did a separate video about it, but I got over it. Everything was fine after a little bit. But yes, let's talk about the 64 gig model. So out of the box, this obviously doesn't have 64 gigs of usable space, but it was a lot less than I expected. It's actually only 42 gigs of usable space. So losing 22 gigs wouldn't be as big of a deal on a bigger drive, but on a small drive already, losing 22 gigs of usable space is kind of a lot. So I was expecting to maybe be able to install like one AAA game, like maybe a God of War or an Elden Ring or something like that. With 42 gigs, you really can't expect to install any larger games up here. So the first day I had it after I recorded the unboxing video, I really didn't play it at all, which is fine because I had other stuff to do. My memory card was scheduled to be here the next day, but it ended up getting delayed 2 more days. So I grabbed the 128 gig SanDisk memory card from one of our Nintendo Switches, and I went ahead and popped it in here because I was like, I want to play something on this. I have to try it. So pop that in here and I played God of War. Do you know how long it took to install God of War on this thing with that memory card? It took 6 hours with this 128 gig SanDisk that worked fine on my Nintendo Switch, but when I put it in here, it was running so slow that the download actually had to pause so the memory card could catch up on writing the data. Like, the write speeds were dropping to kilobytes. I have never seen that before on a memory card. Like, never. I noticed when this whole thing was happening that that part where the memory card is does get pretty hot. So it might have just been thermal throttling. And the memory card that I got 2 days later, which is my 512 gig SanDisk Pro, that memory card had absolutely no issues. I was able to install Cyberpunk in like less than an hour, and that's around the same size as God of War. It was just a weird thing with this memory card. So it's not the Steam Deck's fault that the memory card sucked, but it's just something that you might run into when you sell a device that is really going to depend on microSD for storage. Again, you can upgrade the SSD, but if someone's buying this and not planning to upgrade the SSD, that's what you're going to be stuck with. And I will say, when I got a good memory card, it worked absolutely flawlessly. Like, the download speeds were fine, loading times have been fine. It's really good as long as you have a good memory card, but your mileage may vary. I would recommend, if you buy one for the Steam Deck, to test it while you're still in the return period. So that way, if you do spend a bunch of money to get like a 1 terabyte one, you're not stuck with something that's going to be horrible when it comes to downloading stuff and that's going to take you like 6 hours. Personally, I bought the 64 gig one because I do plan on upgrading the SSD eventually. And it does make it cheaper than buying one of the models that already has an SSD. But at the same time, I also feel like Valve really shouldn't sell this model if you can't really install any games on it. Now, if you're just doing like smaller games or indie games, then that's fine. You can install a few games up here, but realistically, 42 gigs is just not enough space out of the box for something that's essentially a personal computer. So if we look at something like the Nintendo Switch, which only has 32 gigs of storage or 64 for the OLED, it's not as important because, for one, you can buy physical games, which a lot of those don't install, so they don't really use any space on the disc other than for saves. And the games that they have that are downloadable are a lot smaller because they're made specifically for the Nintendo Switch, whereas if you download a game on the Steam Deck, you're going to download all the assets for that game. So even if you don't need 4K assets, you're getting those anyway, and the install size is going to be the same no matter what PC you install it on. So we're just dealing with overall larger files. That's why I think realistically they probably should have went 128 at least on the cheapest model and charged a little bit more money for it, or just not had this model. It's just not very usable out of the box. And the enthusiast market that Valve is selling this to right now is fine, but if they were to sell this at a more mainstream market, like if they were to sell this at Walmart and someone bought it, they'd probably be a little bit frustrated they couldn't play any games up here out of the box. And the 64 gig is fine. I'm not saying don't buy it or anything. It is $400. It's the cheapest for a reason, and I get that. I just think that they should have made one with a more realistic amount of space for the type of games that you might be installing and running up here. Well, let's talk a little bit about the hardware. So you have your thumbsticks, which again are excellent. The buttons and the D-pad, as well as start and select button, all feel great. after playing with this for a while, it really does feel like an Xbox controller. The triggers and the shoulder buttons, initially I didn't like the shoulder buttons, they didn't have enough travel, but I've kind of gotten used to them and they're fine. The reason I knew the buttons up here are good after I've been playing it for a while is I stopped thinking about them. I didn't have to think about the thumbsticks and how they felt or how the buttons felt. It just felt like a normal experience. Like, this is probably the most natural feeling handheld that I've played. It just feels like playing a console. You also have your weird mouse pad, touch pad type things, and they kind of function as D-pads, so you can press on them, and then of course you can kind of scroll in it and it'll become a mouse depending on the game or the application. Like if you're in desktop mode, I'll say they're not that great. I mean, they're okay, I guess, to have mouse controls in this thing, but the acceleration feels a little bit off. It's probably adjustable in the settings somewhere, but it just feels kind of weird. And then the haptics on this one, it vibrates a lot. It kind of makes it feel like a bad scroll wheel, like with the acceleration, because it's like one of those things where if you do that, like if you swipe, the mouse will keep moving a little bit more, like you're scrolling a wheel, like you have one of those trackball mice. It doesn't feel like you're using like a touchpad on a computer. But like I said, for the few things that you would probably need it for, it's fine. I wouldn't expect to realistically play any games that require a mouse, but I do think with some tweaking it'll probably be a lot better. As far as the clicking in part of it, it's just hard to press and it doesn't have that much travel, so that doesn't really feel great either. But I do think it's cool to have these dedicated pads for mouse movement versus just strictly relying on the thumbsticks like some of the other handhelds do. So I don't hate them, they're very okay. I just think they could be a little bit better with some software tweaking. Now along the top you have your volume buttons, your headphone jack, your USB-C port, and your power button. Now for me personally, I'd prefer to have the USB-C port at the bottom because I prefer to have the cord hanging at the bottom when I'm playing it and charging, so it's out of the way, versus it being where it is now, the top, where it has to wrap around and do all kinds of loop-de-loops and stuff. But it's fine either way. It's not that big of a deal. It's just like a small complaint. But other than that, everything up here is excellent. The buttons feel really clicky and responsive. I really don't have any complaints about the hardware except for those minor things that I mentioned with the touchpad and the USB-C placement. The screen is a good size. It's very vibrant. It is super comfortable. I like what they did with the grips, like I mentioned in my unboxing video. There was a learning curve for me. I realized after like 30 minutes to an hour playing, I start to hold the console in weird ways. Like I would just like, I don't know, it's hard to explain. I'll just do this or like this because it's so big. I really had to make sure that I kept my firm grip on it the whole time. But as long as you hold it like this, the way that it's kind of meant to be held, then it's completely fine. I almost forgot about the back buttons. So yeah, it does have these back buttons. I don't use them, but I will say that they did a really good job of balancing these by making these relatively easy to press. They have good click and feedback, but you can still rest your fingers on them without accidentally pressing them. It would take intentional pressure to press them. If you're just resting your hands on them, they're pretty difficult to press by accident. So they actually did a really good job. Like if you don't want to engage with these at all, you don't have to. On the GPD Win 3, that was a big issue for me with the back buttons. I would just hit them by accident. The hardware on this thing is great. I'm super impressed with it. Another thing I want to touch on is SteamOS itself. Now, Steam Deck and SteamOS to me is the complete package. I know you can install Windows on this thing, but SteamOS really takes this to a different level versus the other Windows-based handhelds. The OS itself is just like you boot into it. It's a super simple interface. Like you have your Steam button that takes you to your menu options like library, home, your friends list, and then you have this one that's kind of your settings options, so you can do stuff like control your audio levels or brightness or even your performance settings, and you can even go to advanced settings to tweak like your TDP and lock frame rates. Everything is built in here and it's super easy to access, whether you just want to do basic stuff like just go and play a game, or if you do want to mess with your TDP settings to try to save some battery life. That's all just baked in here and it's super easy to get to. Of course, with SteamOS being based on Linux, not every game runs up here, so it's important to know which games are compatible, and they make it pretty easy. On the store page, they have a Great on Deck section, and all these games have been certified by Valve. They have the green check next to them telling you that they will run on your Steam Deck. If you still want to go to the full store and view games, even if they don't run on your Steam Deck or they haven't been tested, you can, and they will have the corresponding icons next to them. Typically, there's 4 levels. There's the verify that everything works good. There is the yellow exclamation marks, which means it's playable, but it might have issues. They're pretty good about telling you what those issues are if you go to the details of the game. The third one is the question mark, which means it just hasn't been tested. It might work, it might not. I actually found with Multiverses earlier, since it's a newer game, and had the question mark up there, but I installed it and it played just fine. And then there's the not supported, which means they've tested it and does not work. This doesn't always mean that it's not going to work. You can always install it and try it anyway. Like for instance, WWE 2K22 is not supported, but I installed it anyway, and it's playable. Sometimes it just crashes a lot. So yeah, your mileage may vary when it comes to compatibility. For me, I have over 300 games in my library, and only 84 are listed under the Great on Deck section in the library. Again, you can kind of try and use at your own risk, but overall game compatibility is going to be the biggest issue for this thing. But just having an OS that kind of bridges the gap between what you would get from a console like the Switch and what you would get on something like the Win 3, which is a full PC. You still have your desktop mode. You hold the power button, you can switch to the desktop mode to get a full desktop if you want to. Also, the sleep and wake works really well, which in Windows is almost non-existent. But yeah, you can sleep. Who knows what's going to happen to that game when you wake your computer back up. Just to have that functionality, and I actually trust it, I actually use it a lot, and I've never had it mess up on me. So it's pretty awesome. It does make it feel a little bit more like a console versus just a handheld PC. Now, another thing we got to talk about, of course, is the actual gaming experience and performance. And I said it in my GPD Win 3 video, this is going to take a lot for the Steam Deck to impress me because I really love the Win 3. And I was surprised that the Steam Deck impressed me as much as it did. When I first fired up God of War, after the 6 hours of frustration waiting for it to install, I was blown away by it. Like, not only was it playable, but it was actually good. I was just getting above 30. Yes, I do have FSR on balanced, but it looks really good. It looks like playing it on the PS4 or playing it on my PC. And I haven't seen it drop below 30. Like, it usually stays around the 40-ish frames per second. I'm actually running this on original, which I believe are like equivalent to the PS4 graphics settings. So to get above 30 with the PS4 graphics on this thing, it's insane. On the Win 3, I had to set everything to minimum with FSR. Even with FSR and performance, I could not get to 30. Granted, I do have the Core i5 version of the Win 3, so that's obviously going to play a factor into it too. But I think even with the Core i7, either version, it still probably wouldn't consistently hit 30. I actually said in the last video that I preferred streaming it because of how choppy it was, gameplay-wise. But up here, I played probably about 10 hours of God of War on this thing, and it's been awesome. And even a game like Elden Ring, which I played extensively on the Win 3, and it runs really good up there, runs even better up here. Like in a more intensive area, it can maintain above 30 frames, and it's definitely a lot more playable than it is on the Win 3, which is still a really good experience. But the Steam Deck, it kind of just crushes it. The other thing is buggy WWE 2K22, which is buggy on both in different ways. Like up here, I mentioned technically it's not listed as compatible, so I can't really blame it too much, but it crashes a lot. And of course, on the Win 3, I mentioned that weird texture glitch thing that makes people partially invisible. But when it runs up here, again, amazing. I ran it up here just on the default settings without having to drop anything, and it runs at a stable 60. Comparison to the GPD Win 3, I can get 60 up there, but I gotta drop the crowd density down, and I gotta lower the graphics settings. So I tested it with the same settings that I had for the Steam Deck, and of course it still has that weird clothing glitch. But also, it just ran like garbage. It was like someone just running through sludge the whole time. But yeah, graphics-wise, internally at least, Steam Deck is just a lot more powerful. Of course, with the Win 3, you do have Thunderbolt, so you can do an eGPU. And you do have Windows, so you have access to a lot more games. So it's kind of the trade-off. You do get a more powerful experience here. But with the Win 3, you get more compatibility. You can play more games, even if the graphics aren't as good. So I'm not saying that this is the overall better device. They're really two completely different devices. But obviously, if it's the same game on both, the graphics are better up here from what I've seen. I know it's so good that I even tried Cyberpunk up here, which I didn't even attempt on the Win 3. But even Cyberpunk ran really well. I just did the Steam Deck preset for it. And it did dip below 30 occasionally, but I really barely felt the dip below 30. Like overall, I'm just really impressed with the Steam Deck. So to wrap this whole thing up, the Steam Deck as a hardware and software package is incredible. Now, it's not 100% perfect. Like I mentioned earlier, only 80 out of the 300 games in my library are compatible with the Steam Deck. There's also the fact that I'm missing a lot of my games. For instance, I don't have native Game Pass up here. Now, I did install Game Pass streaming up here, which Microsoft provides instructions on their site. They're pretty easy to follow. And it works, but it's still streaming. Sometimes it just has random dropouts. Even when I'm not having internet issues, It's not the way I prefer to play. I do kind of miss having that on my Win 3 that ran Windows. You can install Windows up here, but dual booting is not officially supported by SteamOS at the moment. Valve did say that that's coming, so that might be a valuable option once that's here to kind of make up for those games that I might want to play on Windows. But for now, being that I want to stick to SteamOS because the experience is so great, it does limit me. There is a way to install the Epic Game Store as well, but it's not like an official way to do it. You are going to be limited unless you want to install Windows and kind of play around with that. But I do think that SteamOS really makes this device what it is. Then there's also the 64 gig model. It's really for enthusiasts. I really feel like the value in the 64 gig model is if you want to upgrade it yourself, or like I said, if you're fine with just SD card storage, which does work well as long as you have a good quality SD card. But at this price point and looking at the current handheld PC market, there's really nothing competing with it at this price. So even with me complaining about the 64 gig option, it's still a pretty good price at $400. So overall, I'm really enjoying the Steam Deck. I've been enjoying it so much that I haven't even done half the stuff I need to. I still haven't tested any emulators up here. So I want to see how that experience is. So of course I will have follow-up videos. I want to do an in-depth comparison really with the GPD Win 3 to kind of show both of their strengths and weaknesses. So be on the lookout for that. But until then, if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to tell a friend, tell a coworker, like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell notification to get notified when I drop a video. And I always do at least 2 things at the same time. Peace.